Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Hickerson, and I'm going to speak today a little bit about open source software. First of all, to get a sense of what kind of audience we have today, I understand that a lot of people are project managers. Raise your hand if you're a project manager right now. Ooh, okay. Also, raise your hand if your company does primarily outsourcing. Outsourcing. Wow, okay. So a lot of you. But there are also some of you that maybe aren't in project management and outsourcing. I'm going to do a very general talk about open source today, and I'm actually going to cover a couple different points. But first, let me just say a few words about myself and what I've been doing, who I am. Actually, I've been coming back and forth to Kharkov since about 1995. The first time I was here, I was actually working for... Actually, the first time I came here, I was working not in IT, but for a nonprofit called the American Councils. And as part of that job, I traveled all throughout Kharkov, Luhansk, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and some parts of Poltava, recruiting for different exchange programs sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. I did that for a while, but then I understood that in order to progress in my career, I needed to just go ahead and get another degree. So what I did is I actually went back to the United States and got a Master's of Science in Computer Science and got into IT around 2002. And at that time, I started working for a small company called Clinica. And I'll talk about that company here in just a moment, but that was the first time that I began to work with open source software and produce an open source product. Since then, I've done a number of different jobs. I've worked for Clinica as a developer and a PM. I've also done a little bit of PM work for actually Microsoft Russia. So I was there for about a year and a half in Moscow. And now, since 2012, I've been working in project and product management for another company that sells open source software, Clinica, based in Sunnyvale, California. And I'll talk a little bit about how that is different from Clinica, because they're both in the same space. They're actually competitors, but they both produce open source software. Their strategy is slightly different, and I'll focus on that. So today's talk, like I said, I'm going to be talking about open source software, but I'm going to basically focus on three different things. First of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what is open source at its core, what it really means when you say, I'm working with open source software, or I'm producing an open source product, or I support open source. Those are all three different things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what each one can mean, for you. Also, I'm going to talk about how open source can be used in a project. Maybe you have a situation where a client is coming to you and saying that we need to use open source, and we need to be open source, or we need to produce something that's open source. And what kind of pluses and minuses does that mean when you take on that responsibility in your projects? And finally, we want to talk about when you do open source a project, what kind of responsibilities are you taking on? So when you do actually decide to open source something for your own company, maybe it's something that you developed and you can use internally, but maybe it's something that you'd like to share with others. What exactly are you doing? What exactly are you producing for the internet, basically, for the overall world? What are you saying about your company? So first thing first, I know that we give a prize for the most active question or the most active participant in today's lecture. Let me just throw this out here and see what people say. What do you think it means when a project is open source? What do you think an open source project requires? What's that? Security? Good answer. What's another good answer? In the back there's somebody. Right. What does it mean when our project is open source? Very good answer. Very good answer. That is actually the first thing that you do need when you produce an open source project. Now, basically, when you are producing something by open source, you mean that the project is distributed under a specific software license. And that is, more specifically, a license that you ideally should not have to pay for. Many open source projects are someplace on the internet that you can download on your own time and basically use as is. So basically a number of licenses, for example, there's a very specific set of licenses that are open source. One is called the Lesser GNU Public License. One is called the Apache Public License. One is called the MIT License. Most of these were brought out of academia, and the most important word in each of these is the word public. That is, they're public, they're for public use. But also what's important is to keep in mind that typically 99% of these licenses say at the very beginning, this software is provided as is, and does not imply that there's any extra service provided or any extra liability provided on the part of the people that produce it. Что-то я было много сложного на русском языке. Я могу на русском языке, в принципе, это рассказывать, если это легче вам. В принципе, liabilities нет, короче говоря, обязанностей нет, so to speak. But also what is most important about an open source license is that there is usually a part at the end that talks about derivative works. Derivative works, what is that? That's typically something that you would produce with the help of that software. And licenses can be very different in that regard. Lesser GNU public license is very popular because it says that you can earn money with derivative works of this project. There are other licenses that are more restrictive. What's most famous is the GPL in and of itself, the GNU public license, which basically says you can use this license, you can use this software, you can produce stuff with it, but you can never earn money because this was given to you for free. And so basically it's like наследствие, basically saying that you inherit the fact that this software is free. And in fact, the GNU public license was one of the reasons why big business in the 1990s was very opposed to open source at the very beginning. Microsoft, for example, was very opposed, calling the GNU public license even a viral license because it basically forced you to never earn any money from the work that you created. And in response to that, that's why we created the lesser GNU public license, which allowed for commercial reuse. So that's the very most important part of open source licensing. Now, there are some other points in this slide. But they're all secondary compared to the license. Basically, we talk about different platforms that you can use for giving away code. So a very popular platform nowadays is called GitHub. You may have heard of it. It's based on the software code repository that's called Git. That was actually also invented by Linus Torvalds, which is why a lot of people use it. But also it embraces the agile methodology. So for example, Dragos just talked about the idea that you would pull a task from one stage to the other in your Kanban. There is actually a command in Git where you would say pull request, and automatically that code moves into a new stage. So you can approve it or deny it if you want to. So it's very much reflective of the agile methodology and agile teachings. Now, there are other platforms that we've used in the past, one of which is called SourceForge, which is based on top of a different type of repository called SVN or Subversion. Another one is called Bitbucket, which I believe you can use. You can pick your own type of repository. You can either use Git or Subversion for that. So there's many different websites and platforms that you can use to host your code and use it for other people to download, compile, and use as they see fit. Now, the last point here, the way to support itself. This is where we start to get into something a little bit more interesting about strategy in business. If you have a project, if, say, you're a company and you produce a project in open source, but you want to make money from it, how are you going to do that? How are you going to earn money from something that is essentially given away for free? What's the different strategy that you can use here? I talk a little bit about, so there's some early open source businesses that came out of academia. One thing I forgot about was talking about the very first open source project, which was created by an academic, Donald Knuth. He did not expect to earn any money from it whatsoever. So he produced it and said, other people in academia can use this project. This project actually is called Latex. And it's basically a program that allows you to print out mathematical models, subscript, superscript, Greek symbols. And in 1984, that was very hard to do. Nowadays, it's very easy to do with your latest copy of Microsoft Word or whatever. But in 1984, you just had the command line. You had to print it out somehow. Latex was the easiest way to do it. And so he thought that academics would be able to use this, and he gave it away for free to all the universities that he knew. But in the late 90s and 2000s, open source became more in vogue, and we actually had a lot of businesses that were saying, we're open source, we're giving away software, but we're also selling something. What were they selling? Typically, more often than not, they were doing something like they were selling services. They were selling consultants who would come to your company and say, we have this project, and we know how to use it, and we'll set it up, and then we'll offer training in it, and so we'll be able to work and earn a lot of money that way. That was successful to a point, because actually, let me go ahead and use this for just a moment. They would go out and they would try to attract more funding. They would say, we're an open source company, we're moderately profitable, we're trying to earn more funding. And they would go to an investor and they'd say, well, we need some more money. And the investor would say, well, what are you doing now? Well, we're selling services. And this is what would go on in the investor's mind. They'd see on one side, they'd see possible profit. And then on the other side, they'd see possible costs. And they'd say to themselves, well, if you add one consultant, you've got costs going up, and you've got profit going up. Maybe you're working 40 hours a week or something like that. You've got possible 40 hours a week based on that one consultant. Next consultant, again, more costs, more profit. But what they really want to see, what venture capitalists really want to see, is they want to see a chart that goes like this. Whoop, just like that. Unfortunately, if you're giving away your software for free, how are you going to make this extra money? How are you going to make this extra bit right here? Typically, you would do it through selling licenses, but you can't do that with open source software. So where's the money to be made? You might get inventive, for example. Like, let's see, y'all are very smart people, and I have to give a prize away at the end of this thing. What do you think might be a way to earn money with open source software if you don't have the ability to charge for licenses and you can only sell services? Maybe you can try something else. Sir, go ahead.
Yeah. So as is mentioned on your slide, we can sell support, or we can sell trainings, or we can sell some extra features that are not open source.
Extra features that are not open source. Very good, very good. That's right. Typically what would happen is that a company would eventually come around and say, we're going to sell an enterprise edition of our software, an enterprise edition. And typically that would mean that they'd have to add an extra module on, and somehow that would work for them. What might be some other ways? What might be another way that, that you might earn more money from this point up here? Advertising might be one. If your software is very popular, you might be able to put advertising at the beginning of your header. Many of the initial open source browsers would give their browser away, but they would have that one little magical bar at the top where advertisers could put something. That was very popular in the 90s. Google, of course, we know, has made a lot of advertising without giving, of course, they're not giving their search engine away, but they certainly are publishing everything. And they're publishing everything about MapReduce, and they're publishing everything about all their algorithms, but at the same time, they're earning a lot of money through advertising. So I want to take a moment about this slide and talk a little bit about an open source company that I worked for and how we earned money off and on during the course of about 7 or 8 years through the life of the company. I worked for a company called Clinica, and I realize that's a very bad translation in Russian. That's Clinica. Это просто наша клиника закрытого типа and all that stuff. But basically what we did is we created something that people needed, very specific to the health space. As I mentioned in the slide, it was a very small vertical. What do I mean by that? I mentioned earlier today that I work in EDC. EDC is actually an acronym for Electronic Data Capture for Clinical Trials. And what does that mean? That means that basically when we get an engagement for a client, the client usually comes to us and say, I need to collect data from 80 different patients who are going to be coming to our clinic 3 times a week, and they're going to be submitting a blood test, a physical, a number of different forms, a number of different files, and that all needs to be imported into the system and then exported into a format that's good for our biostatistics team, which can be SAS. It can be another open source product called SPSS. It can be Excel. But basically, we need to collect all that data and somehow put it out there. Now, in 2003, when we started working, this was basically occupied by one major player, Oracle Clinical. Oracle Clinical was basically the one player that would occupy that space and collect data on clients. The other major player was Microsoft Access. So unfortunately, Microsoft Access was a very crude tool in the fact that it was a great database, but at the same time, when you wanted to export to any type of standard, you would have to do a lot of data scrubbing and data fixing and things like that in order to make sure that it would work for you. So what we did is we applied for a grant from the U.S. National Institute of Health, and we got what's called an SBIR grant, Small Business and Innovation, to work on an open source model and to be able to give our source code away for free. And They gave us the money. It was not a lot of money. It was maybe like $500,000 for the first 2 years. But it allowed us to get our product created, get our product out there, and begin to sell this product to different people. Now, a couple different things happened which helped us greatly. For one thing, we sold our product for a while, and we gave it away for free, and then we started getting calls from clients outside the United States, because it turns out that there are a lot of developing countries that want to collect data on patients and start to do work with pharmacological companies, but they don't have the money for lab infrastructure. So we started getting calls from Africa, we started getting calls from China, we started getting calls from India, people who wanted to actually use this product. We also started getting inquiries from very small players in Europe. Like, for example, there's an example partner here called Trial Data Solutions. Trial Data Solutions is one guy in Netherlands who works with just a specific set of labs, and he found that he could set up these forms rather quickly and collect data using our software. So he agreed to be our partner and resell some of the products for us. And so what we found is also the one other thing that actually contributed to this was the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, because everybody started to say, well, we got to cut back on costs. We can't really pay that big license fee to Oracle anymore. So we got to cut that down and maybe find something out there that's free, or close to free, or maybe something that's a little bit more affordable. And there was Clinica, and we were able to sell our product to them. So over time, we grew a user community, and I'll talk a little bit about how a user community works in just a moment. But we grew a user community, we grew support, we grew basically a number of different channels where we could grow the product. And eventually, we were able to become a profitable business that supports actually its own conference, where we also make money, just like this conference today. And we also were able to create a number of different online resources for people interested in getting used to the project, or getting introduced to the project, rather. Also, we created, when I moved to Clinica, we created a significant fork of the project. Now, what does that mean? A fork is generally a different project that stems out of that project by itself. And maybe it's moved away because we wanted to make some other changes that weren't supported by Clinica. That's the reason why we forked. Also, we wanted to focus a little bit more on project quality, and also we wanted to redesign it so that it was branded to our image. So that fork exists, and that is also available for download, but it's a slightly different strategy, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. So again, coming back to the money, because it's important. Many of you in the outsourcing industry may have met this quote in one or another form: never outsource your core competency. If your core competency is making widgets, or plumbing sinks, or creating books, then you never put that out there. You go ahead and you can outsource everything else that you want. Your accounting, your billing, whatever have you. Outsource all that, but never outsource your core competency. That is a lesson that many open source companies have learned over the years. Clinica, for example, was kind of restricted by this model because they gave away the first versions of their source code entirely for free. So it was very difficult for them to make money, and they found that it kind of came around to bite them. However, a lot of companies are now saying that they support open source. What does that necessarily mean? A large company that already has a lot of money can certainly fund a number of different open source projects. Like, for example, if we go to GitHub right now, we'll see, for example, that there is a company page for Facebook. There's a company page for Google. There is a company page for Netflix. And we'll see that when we go to the Facebook project page, we'll look through all the projects. They're all very interesting. They're all very popular. But you'll never see the project there that says Facebook homepage. Skачайте sami, делай свой Facebook. It just won't be there. What will be there, it will be different things that they use for DevPro, for example, for DevOps, DevOps processes. They'll use things for system administration. They have their own version of the MySQL database, which they've put online, which you can download. You can use Facebook's database without the data, of course, because the data, of course, is their core competency. So what they're doing is they're doing a lot of smaller projects, or they're doing their own language, For example, just recently, Apache put out a new programming language, I believe it's called Swift, which works on iOS. Just recently, they announced that too is open source, so you can now download it and work with it much quicker, much more, there are fewer barriers for you to get involved with that programming language. Google is much the same way. They've open sourced something called Dart. They've open sourced another language called Go. So they're finding that while they are supporting OSS, they don't give away their core business. Some gentleman in the audience mentioned Jira. Jira, of course, also says that they support open source. What does that mean? They don't give away their code, but they say if your project is open source, we'll allow you to use all of our products for free. So they're allowing open source companies to basically get used to Jira, and then it's kind of a selling tool, because if you're already used to Jira, then maybe you'll pay for different add-on services after that. Also, several different types of models came up, like freemium and software as a service, or platform as a service. And I want to say a few words about Clinica and what I'm doing now, for example. Clinica would produce something that was called a freemium model. Why? Because they gave away most of what they have for free, and then over time they would charge for the enterprise edition. CleanCapture is a little bit different, because what we are doing is we're actually open sourcing the model, but we are hosting it entirely on our own infrastructure. So it's a cloud infrastructure, a platform as a service, and we allow integrations with other different projects as well. But at the same time, you can download it, but you don't get the platform. You can't access the cloud just by yourself. You have to pay us for access to the cloud. So as time went on, we found that people were still giving things away, but not necessarily giving code away. And there are a number of different examples here, but I understand that you'll be able to get the slides later so you can take a look at them. I'll just focus on one example, which is the second one here. Zedshaw, one guy, very small company, basically decided to release a book called Learn Python the Hard Way. Learn Python the Hard Way. And the structure of the book is very simple. 32 pages, each page a separate exercise. You basically type in the exercise, you're done. Move on to the next page. First half of the book, very easy exercises. Second half of the book, already slightly harder exercises. So by the end of the 32 pages, you are already getting some mastery, entering into mastery of Python. A lot of people liked that idea. They liked that structure very much, and so they decided to copy it. And all of a sudden you saw Learn Ruby the Hard Way. And all of a sudden you saw Learn C the Hard Way. And all of a sudden you saw Learn Common Lisp the Hard Way. I think that was difficult from page one. But basically he noticed this and he said, that's all right. You know what I'll do? I'll publish the structure of the book online in Latex. So again, in this open source project. And you can copy that and make as many different types of the book as you want. However, the content is exclusively mine. And so now what he's done is he's released a version 3 of Learn Python the Hard Way, together with video tutorials. And for each download, you have to pay somewhere in the realm of $39. So he's still making money, and he's made a specific delineation between what's free and what's definitely not free. So let's move on to the second part of the presentation about whether or not you should use open source in your own projects. And so we'll open this up as well to discussions, because I understand, that we don't want to make it completely, you all are very quiet. I hope you're not bored. I really hope. So first of all, scenario one, you get approached by a client and they say, we need you to install and deploy this open source application for us. We want to use it in our project. It's 100% free, so it should be no problem to install, right? You guys can install it, no problem, right? Shouldn't be a problem at all. Should you be worried? Should you be worried? Yes, you definitely should. You should definitely look before you leap. The things you should be looking for in this open source project are, of course, how mature is the project? How mature is it? If it's been worked on for a while, if there are a number of contributors, if there's just one contributor, that might be a problem. How stable is the project? And you also want to take a look at the project's license and make sure that it's a fairly standard one. One time, Clinica, for a client, for a project, used an open source library from a site called servlets.com. Servlets.com. And basically, it was built around a number of different tutorials, and the author of servlets.com said, well, I'll just publish these all as open source, so you're free to use them. You're free to use them. And so we used them for a specific tool without getting into too much details. But then we decided to do a license audit on our product and take a look at all the different libraries, because there were quite a few, not just this one. And we looked down the list, my CTO looked down the list, and he said, okay, LGPL, fine. The Apache Public License, fine. MIT, fine. Serverless.com had a custom license. And so he was like, postmortem. Open up the custom license, and it turns out that it was fairly standard, except at the bottom paragraph, and it said derivative works are fine, you can earn money on this. But as I am an author, I would stipulate that you need to buy one of my books for every single developer that you have in your company. And the CTO looked at that and said, "Я это чушь не пойму, вообще-то, давайте перепишем." Let's rewrite the code. So we had to rewrite the code and write that library out of our application. So look before you leap. That's my advice in scenario number one. Now, scenario number two. We need to merge two open source projects for a client, bring them together. But don't worry, since they're already free code, I'm sure, everything's pretty much built already. You just need to somehow integrate them. Integrate them. Integrate them. How worried should you be about integration? Very worried, right? And whenever I hear integration, even if it's not open source, I always kind of get a little worried, but I always kind of like have to really check myself, because it's really there are a lot of there's a phrase in English, still waters run deep, right? So there's always something going on down there. Chortivod, says something like that. So you have to really take a look at both projects and make sure that their maturity and their development are both fairly straightforward and fairly active. For example, if you get asked to create a Twitter API plugin for WordPress, that's probably okay. There's probably a lot out there that you can use. If you want to, say, for example, a little bit more of a more narrower example, if you need to create a login for your user management system to, say, for example, a customer relationship management system, it will depend on the project. So, for example, I would take a look at Sugar CRM, which is a project that's open source that uses customer relationship management. They publish their own library of modules and extensions. So they actually say, you can use Sugar CRM with LDAP, you can use Sugar CRM with Microsoft Windows, you can use it with Linux, you can use it with OpenLDAP. And so they are actually fairly straightforward about what type of things you can and can't integrate with their system. Clinica is much the same way. They have a certain library of extensions, what they call extensions, and you can basically say, well, I want to use Clinica, but I want to use Clinica with the statistic language that's called R, just R. And so basically, they will be able to say there's an extension for that, and you can use that. However, you can also get caught in situations where one product is very well advanced and the other product is not. So, for example, I was tasked once to integrate Java Spring, which is a very well advanced project, probably a lot of people know it, with a very new standard in XML.